Hello APers, we're back with 5.1 Part 2, our second vocab video. Let's get right into it, and our first word is Utopian Socialism. Alright, so first off, let's talk about socialism a little bit. So socialism is basically the idea that the workers would eventually own the means of productions instead of a middle class like the bourgeoisie. So basically it's the idea that the workers collectively as a group would own their own factories and would own all the private industries. In socialism, we really wouldn't see much private property. It would be collectively owned by the whole group. And you wouldn't have like a leader, an ownership class who owns everything. It would be the workers who would own it. Utopian socialism was an idea that they would try to convince people of the ruling class, or the bourgeoisie, the people up on top, to basically give up their factories so everyone could share in it and everyone would own everything, and that everyone would then be paid equally and have equal access to the things that they need. This is the basic idea of utopian socialism. So it doesn't involve any violence or revolution, but it's the idea to convince the people who own the factories to give up much of their factories to the workers. Significant because it's organizing workers who feel like they're not being paid very well, and during the Industrial Revolution they weren't. As a way to try to organize workers against the injustices and unequal pay that they experienced during the Industrial Revolution. Robert Owen is a person who really believed in the idea of utopian socialism. So again, they believed that it would create a self-sufficient community where everyone would own basically the factory. And Robert Owen, as it says right here, this is pretty good right here, sets up a utopian factory where he supplied good housing, education, and fair wages for his workers. This is significant because this goes against the capitalism that existed in the global capitalism that was happening during the Industrial Revolution. It was a form of resistance against that capitalism. This will be a common historical significance in this part of the vocab. Karl Marx is most famously associated with communism and socialism, but mostly communism. And he wrote many thousands of pages critiquing capitalism and saying the weaknesses that existed in capitalism. He was a communist who advocated a violent revolution that the proletariat, a word we see here which basically means the working class, that the proletariat or the working class, the common workers, would overthrow the bourgeoisie or the middle class people who owned the factories in a violent revolution, and they would start communism where everyone would be paid equally for their equal work. Again, very significant as this will lead to a lot of resistance against global capitalism, and this will become even more significant in our next era when some countries like the Soviet Union and China have communist revolutions and form communist countries. Communism is an economic system. Read some of this over here so you can copy that down too. It believes in the collective group ownership in a planned economy that basically everyone owns the factories. They're not individually owned by any one owner. And it's the theory that everyone pools in their resources and labor, and then everything is evenly distributed to people as they need it. Karl Marx is the person who really gets communism going with his books like Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. Very significant. It is resistance against global capitalism in the Industrial Revolution in this age. And also, like I said before, countries like China, Soviet Union, and Cuba will become communist countries in the contemporary era, the era after this. The Communist Manifesto is a short book by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And it is basically the manifesto, or what communists basically believe, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, going against the bourgeois and capitalism that existed, especially in the Industrial Revolution, and speaking about revolt and how the proletariat or the common workers have to revolt against basically the bourgeoisie. And if you see a symbol for communism, you see the hammer and the sickle. This is like for the farm workers. This is for the factory workers, the hammer. And it's that the workers should unite together to go against the ruling class to have more equality. And that is the Communist Manifesto. Main author, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, also helped to write it as well. The proletariat. The proletariat are the common, ordinary workers. That could be a factory worker, that could be a farmer. Karl Marx, when he talks about the Industrial Revolution, that the proletariat are the common workers, one of the most famous quotes that he gave is that the proletariat have nothing to lose but their chains, meaning that he says, well, they're not quite slaves, they're pretty close to it, working for the bourgeois, the people who own the factories. That's Karl Marx's opinion. So in communism, the belief is that the proletariat will rise up in a violent rebellion and will rebel against the ruling class, or the bourgeoisie, and will collectively own the factories and everything that they make and evenly distribute to everyone. Significant because it's a way to get workers who are oftentimes in the Industrial Revolution being used and exploited for their labor, and to get them to try to unite and rebel against global capitalism. And there are several places in the world where this does happen, and there does become communist countries. Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks are pretty extreme communist members in the Soviet Union and in some other countries, but mainly we're going to associate them with Russia, which will become the Soviet Union in our next era. They are extreme communists who are working for violent revolution in Russia, and they eventually do succeed it, and they have Russia will become a communist country. This will happen in our next era, in the contemporary era, but much of its beginnings happened during the Industrial Revolution, when people are organizing and trying to fight for workers' rights. It has high ideals, but a lot of bad things come along with it too. But they lead a revolution that does eventually take over Russia and will turn it into a country called the Soviet Union, which we will go over in the contemporary era. Anarchism, this is a philosophy that goes against capitalism, goes against any form of ruling with people being on top of another, goes against any form of exploitation. It is, as the sign says, for a society without states or borders where people are seen as equals. So a rejection of authority, belief in self-management, a rejection of hierarchy, freedom and individual rights. Basically, it is to get rid of government as possibly much as you can. That would be anarchism, to almost where there's no government. Anarchy pretty much almost means that there's no government, no one's really in charge anymore. Ironically, the closest we've been to anarchy was probably when we were hunters and gatherers. But it would mean there'd be no borders, which would also mean that there'd be like no police officers, no military. Some people, this sounds like complete chaos and horrible. For other people, this sounds like it would be wonderful. This is what anarchy is. It's significant again because this is a resistance to global capitalism that existed during the Industrial Revolution. No countries or anything formed, but a lot of rebellion against capitalism does come from anarchists. And you can see anarchists still at protest even today, trying to spread anarchism. Okay, we'll go to the next word. The Trans-Siberian Railway. This was a railway that went all the way across the Soviet Union, Russia, all the way across Russia at this time during the Industrial Revolution. And this was built basically when we see the Second Industrial Revolution with the growth of trains and railways. And basically, this was built, it was rushed. Some of the rails were built with wood, but it was Russia trying to push ahead and industrialize as fast as possible so they could have access to the resources across the whole vast, huge country that is Russia. Now, it did allow them to move things back and forth, which helped their country, but it was also really hard on the workers who built this thing and led to a lot of resistance against the Tsar, which is short for Caesar, which is the person who was ruling Russia at this time, basically as a king in tradition, like Peter the Great and Ivan the Terrible. So this was built, it led to better transportation for goods, but also led to resistance of the people against the Tsar. The Tanzimat movement occurred in the Ottoman Empire. We see the years there between 1836 and 1876. These reforms, very much influenced by Europe, and it was the idea to try to modernize the Ottoman Empire, which was sinking a little bit when we get into our modern era. So many reforms are to allow more freedoms for people who are living in the Ottoman Empire, especially non-Muslims, a lot of tax reform, a lot of ways to try to take power just away from the Sultan and make it more spread out amongst other people. The Tanzimat movement or Tanzimat reforms work for a while, but eventually they're stopped by the Sultan and they don't really achieve their goal. It is a response to how the world is changing around the Ottoman Empire as the Industrial Revolution is going on. As they start to fall behind, they try to modernize, but they don't really do it quick enough. They don't do it in time. And this eventually will lead to the Ottoman Empire taking a fall when we get to the contemporary era, although they had a pretty good run. The self-strengthening movement was a movement that happened during the Qing dynasty in our modern era, and it was a time to make reforms to the government and also bringing the adoption of Western firearms, machines, and industry. The idea was to try to move China up forward, especially with the Industrial Revolution that was happening in Europe and in America and Japan and Russia. And it was a way to try to get China to catch up. The problem was that this was stopped by the authority. Basically, the Empress of China stops the self-strengthening movement from happening, and this will really hurt China when it comes to this era, as they will see themselves defeated by powers like Britain, other European powers during this era, which leads China from being near the top in almost all of world history to them taking a serious dive down. That is the self-strengthening movement which occurred in China. Muhammad Ali is a leader of Egypt who broke away from the Ottoman Empire. Military resisted them and wanted to make Egypt more independent. And one way of doing this was by growing and selling cotton to Britain. So he did this to try to make Egypt become more free. Ironically, it allowed Britain coming and Egypt basically producing raw materials and resources for Britain, and for a while basically being owned and controlled by the British Empire. That's the significance of Muhammad Ali. Well, he does a lot for Egyptian nationalism, tries to make them their own country. By selling cotton to Britain, he realizes they kind of get rid of one empire, the Ottoman Empire, to have the British Empire come in and then use them for their natural resources. That is Muhammad Ali. So Germany starts state pensions and public health. This is a way of going against the negative effects of capitalism, especially in the Industrial Revolution. So what they basically do is they give people retirement accounts that when they're working, the state will put money away for their retirement so they'll be able to retire when they're done and they won't die in poverty after working their whole lives. Also, it starts public health, which means that people can start to be able to go to a hospital publicly, and they can go there without having to pay a high cost, pay almost nothing, to have their health taken care of. And this can keep the workers, healthy, be able to keep working. And when Germany starts this, basically, to go against many of the negative effects of the Industrial Revolution was having on common workers. And it's a strong way to fight against, workers who are working all day for almost no wages and see their health go down, especially, and can be poor in old age after working their entire life for a factory. Public education begins in Europe and the United States during the Industrial Revolution as a way to educate the masses of people, to give them a basic education so that they can, before they start working in their jobs. It is modeled, a lot of people would say the factory model of education comes in this time, where you take people and you teach them in the same age groups, in the same class, in the same subjects, so you can mass give the education to as many people as possible. This again begins in a place called Prussia, which is known as Germany, England, and the United States during the Industrial Revolution, and it will lead eventually to a growth of education in the working class people, who will be able to start moving up the ladder a little bit because they have an education and will be able to advance themselves. The bourgeoisie were a new social group that came during the modern era of the Industrial Revolution. Their power increases because they own the banks, the industries, or they are professionals, or they could even be a small business owner. But they are seen as the people in society who own the private property. They own the factories, or they have ownership of their own work and can make money. They have money to spend. They are not the aristocracy. They're not rich because of their name. They're rich because of what they own or what they've come to own in their lifetime. This would be a class that communists were against, and they would see that we're exploiting or using the workers. The bourgeoisie would say, well, we're starting these factories and providing jobs for people, would be their reason. It said, of course we want to make a profit. That's why we start a factory. The historical significance is we see a new group, and this will radically change our social hierarchy in the Industrial Revolution.